It's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Wallach, who is the award-winning author of 5 books of nonfiction and 2 novels, as well as nearly 1,000 articles, essays, reviews, and columns in such publications as the New York Times, the Oregonian, Sports Illustrated, Men's Journal, Golf Magazine, Men's Health, Money Magazine, and many others. He has worked as a columnist covering such subject areas as golf, fitness, travel, financial, and consumer matters, and other subjects. He holds a master's degree in fiction writing from Brown University and a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Vassar College. Jeff hails from New York, but he lives, writes, and fishes and plays golf, soccer, and what's those? Euchre in Portland, Oregon. So please welcome Jeff to the podium. Thank you.
Sure. I'm just going to clear this. All right. Hello, Rotarians. Thanks for having me. I have a talk that I put together just for you. This is its debut. I hope it's not a bomb. If it is, give me the signal. And I may have to talk fast because I'm not sure exactly how long it's going to take. When you read it to yourself, it's faster than when you read it out loud. So this is called Truth and Fiction, in truth and in fiction. I like to think that I started my career as a writer the moment I was born, and exciting things began happening around me that I either experienced and remembered or that I was told about at some point, and which provided potential material for something I might write even 50 years later. And we're all storytellers in this manner, that whether we bother to actually write down these stories of our lives or tell them to others, or we just hold on to them for our own purposes, depends on each person. Sometimes what we do with our stories is the story. I began actually writing down some very awfully told stories in about the 7th grade when I had a teacher who encouraged me. And for teachers, this is both a beautiful tale and a sad thing, because Ms. Hutner, whom I've tried many times to find over the years, likely has no idea how 1 year in her classroom essentially determined the shape of my life, which is also a story in itself. So if you know a Ms. Hutner, or you have a friend who is a teacher, or you are or were one, kudos to you. You should know that somewhere out there is a student who is impacted by something you did or said. Even if you don't remember it, or you thought that kid was a ne'er-do-well headed for a life of mischief and larceny. All through school, I wrote stories with the notion that I would eventually mature into a novelist someday when my stamina increased enough. I wrote for the literary magazine in high school, and I wrote chapters of a novel for my senior thesis in college. After college, I entered possibly the least practical graduate program ever invented, a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. What I learned there mostly was the answer to the age-old question of whether creative writing can actually be taught. And the answer was, not by the professors running that program, who were mostly bitter, underpublished, misanthropic novelists who needed to teach to make a living, but resented the work, the students' work, and probably much else in their academic lives. But they did get to wear those cool robes with the colorful hoods at graduation each year. So there was that. 2 years later, having learned little in my writing program and not a single practical skill that would help me earn a living as a writer, I embarked upon a 35-year detour from fiction and began a career as a freelance journalist. Insurance business, or the mortgage business, or owning a retail store, in that to survive, you must continually sell. Well, this was a fantastic career that I was lucky to have, and it sent me around the world in search of other people's stories and allowed me conversations with novelists and athletes and Nobel Prize winning scientists it was also a sales job. A freelancer must continually pitch new ideas to magazine editors in the hope of selling approximately one story per week, for, in my case, 3.5 decades. The selling of the stories, which involves dreaming up story ideas for each specific publication, which means knowing the publications, initial research, a well-crafted proposal, the presentation of appropriate credentials, and much other work only constitutes the labor that precedes an actual assignment. And to sell one story, a writer usually has to pitch 3 or 5. But once you close a sale, then comes the fun part, which in my case took me to golf courses and whiskey distilleries and castles in Ireland and Scotland, scuba diving in the Andaman Sea off Thailand, to Australia and Nepal, British Columbia, and even to coffee shops and restaurants in my own neighborhood in Southeast Portland. All places where I interviewed earnest people who most often had a passion for whatever they were doing with their lives in the same way I had a passion for writing. Of course, the travel and research and interviews preceded the work of actually writing the stories, which in itself is a difficult process, but always satisfying, like I imagine fine carpentry would be if I knew even how to drive a nail into a board, or performing music if I played an instrument, or almost any other endeavor that requires a talent that I don't have. I worked as a journalist, meaning I was essentially an entrepreneur for every type of magazine you can imagine. My first paying job was for a free newspaper here in Portland called The Downtowner, that some of you may remember. I pitched The Downtowner some stories and got a call from the editor who said they were looking for someone to write a weekly column about office life, which was hilariously ironic to me, since office life was the antithesis of everything I expected from my own future, and something I had no experience with. But I took the gig. Hey, it paid $25 a week. And so my first real job as a journalist was actually as a fiction writer. Every week, I made up a story about something that happened at the office I didn't work at. Not too long after that, I moved to New York City and started writing very short pieces for some very big magazines in the subject areas of sports, fitness, business and finance, science, travel, environmental issues, and more. And then the stories got bigger and the magazines better, and I was making a living. I like to think I am the only living journalist in the history of journalism who wrote the same story for both Popular Science and 17 magazines. Those of you who are my generation or older will remember something called print, that ancient art form in which words appeared in ink on something called paper. And you didn't need a battery or a power cord to read stories delivered this way. With the advent of the internet, the 5,000-year history of the printed word that began when the ancient Sumerians started writing on clay was essentially transported. And I don't mean transported slowly and methodically, as in carried by hand or strapped to the hindquarters of a horse or driven in the back of a vehicle with wheels. I mean transported like they accomplished with that little remote control in Star Trek, very suddenly and to an entirely new place. I remember a conversation I had around that time with a friend of mine who worked as an executive in the magazine business. Early on, he was very prescient about what was to come with the internet. Everyone was overly excited about the amount of information that was suddenly becoming available to anyone with a computer or access to a library where they had a computer. But my friend predicted that what would ultimately prove important wasn't the amount of information, but the quality of it. And that we were actually going to need to find a way to access less information as long as it was the best or the right information. And that was before the days when a Google search rewarded you with 10 million answers to a simple question like, what should I watch tonight? At first, the internet was terrific for freelance journalists, as we now had many new markets open to us, and editors around the globe were scrambling to find enough content to fill the endless pages that no longer had to be printed on paper with ink. And there was rejoicing throughout the writerly land. But the key word in this part of the tale is editors, those gatekeepers who had previously erected at least minimal barriers, however low they might have been in some cases, so that things that were published attained at least a certain level of quality and integrity and comprehensible structure, and maybe even grammatical correctness and honesty, and all sorts of other adjectives that once described journalism. But at the same time that editors were trying to impose their mad skills on the explosion of content, pretty much anyone with access to a computer suddenly realized, hey, I can be a writer too. And so websites proliferated throughout the land, not owing anything to integrity or quality or structure, but which were able, with no gatekeepers, to basically publish instantaneously anything created by anyone working in a dark basement beside a murky fish tank in the home of parents who were disappointed that their 30-year-old hadn't gone out. And so we entered an age where the volume of content far outstripped measures of quality. And yet, many readers remained untroubled by a grammatical or spelling error, or maybe even an error in fact, because information was now so easy to get. And by God, it was free. I could go on about this for the rest of my time, but let me just take you to the far end of what we call in the writing business the story arc, and tell you that the eventual outcome of the internet on old school writers was a dilution of the power and impact of their research and hard work and skills honed over a lifetime of back pain from leaning over a desk. Which is another way of saying, for example, that my payment for stories went from a high of about $4 per word in the days when print ruled to about 50 cents per word if I could even land a paying assignment in the internet era. Not only that, but those of us who depended on daily newspapers and airline magazines and other forms of print to earn our living saw our markets not just shrinking, but actually disappearing. I had a conversation with one of my editors at a custom publishing company that produced a monthly airline magazine. He told me the airline had done some math and they figured out just the fuel costs for carrying 200 or 300 copies of a 150-page magazine back and forth across the country all day, every day on an entire fleet of airplanes came to about $1 million a page. Which is why the airline decided to stop producing a magazine at all. And the custom publishing company was forced to lay off all its employees and then closed its doors after many decades of producing a fun and entertaining and visually evocative product. So thanks, Internet. All of which is to say that when I saw the writing was on the screen, if not on the wall, I decided to quit journalism before it fully quit me. I was lucky enough to have made a little money over the years in some other entrepreneurial ventures so that I didn't have to earn a living from journalism anymore. And so half a lifetime after graduating with my master's of fine arts in fiction writing, I again turned my hand to trying to produce some fine art of my own. I'd been writing stories and novels on the side for most of my life with little publishing success, but I knew this was still my calling and what I wanted to do with my remaining time. And so at 56 years of age, I embarked upon the one career that could be described as a dumber business even than freelance journalism, writing novels. So when people ask me which writing genre I prefer, journalism or fiction, I usually say that journalism is easier because you don't have to invent anything, but that fiction is more fun because you get to invent it all. But really, novel writing is a combination of the two, because even when you make things up, sometimes you have to do research to make sure that the things you've invented are believable and correct, especially if you're a recovering journalist with an unreasonable penchant for getting things right. Even though I'm already about halfway done with this talk, I'd like to begin with a story about my mother. When I was around 50 years old and visiting her in Florida, she offhandedly mentioned that I must be so fond of golf and whiskey, two subjects I had written about a lot in magazines, because I'd inherited this fondness from my Scottish great-grandfather. For a second, everything froze, like when you hit the pause button on a movie so you can go into the kitchen for more ice cream. My what? I said. You know, your Scottish great-grandfather, she said. For some reason, my mother hadn't thought to mention this previously. So when the movie started moving again, I was a little surprised. So I took a DNA test as a way of either proving or disproving this bombshell lobbed into my middle age, as any journalist would try to do. And sure enough, it turned out I'm 12% Scottish. This was the beginning of my research into genealogy and DNA and related subjects, but even more deeply into the writing of my first novel, Mr. Wizard. My research wasn't so much to learn more about my great-grandfather, which I also did inadvertently, but to research a story that was forming in my head. I would say in my fictional head, meaning the head in which I think about fiction, but then you might think my actual head is. Anyway, an idea formed, a real idea, but fictionalized. For starters, my own newly discovered Scottish ancestry was transformed into Irish ancestry by the time it got into the novel. Why? Having been to both countries many times over the years, I determined that for me, the Irish are just a little funnier and more outwardly emotional and, well, extremely entertaining to be around. So I changed the character to ancestry because I could. You get to do that as a novelist. And I did it just because it also seemed right. And sometimes you have to listen when the story tells you what to do. So with my mother's revelation, I had the beginning of my tale. Someone learns in midlife that in the case of Mr. Wizard, his father may not have been who he was led to believe. Then I applied a little of what I was learning from my own initial research, taking the DNA test, and wrapped it into the developing story. I described how one of the characters, Philip Elliott, learned more about himself and where he came from and who he was from his DNA test than he had learned from his unforthcoming mother in the first 50 years of his life. Writing fiction is sometimes a reverse engineering of real life. Now I had a somewhat defined search, or at least my character, Philip Elliott, did, to find out who his real father was. Although all of the responsibility for this was still in my hands, not Philip's. But rather than pursuing facts to discover a conclusion, as I would have in journalism, I started with the conclusion, since I already knew who Philip's father was in the book, and I built the structure of the novel to link the search to that predetermined conclusion. But as I built it, the story grew a little more complicated. When Philip reveals this shocking fact about their father to his brother Spencer, the boys talk about how their mother was always a master of misdirection. But several weeks later, Spencer calls Philip back to reveal another twist, that he's also half Jewish, as would be expected since they have the same Jewish mother, but he's not half Irish. Now we've got the premise of the whole novel. The brothers are going to follow the same sort of path that many folks are familiar with from their own research into family history, or even just from hearing family stories over many years. The only thing clear at this time to Philip and Spencer inside the novel is that most likely their supposedly Jewish father, Jack Elliott, supposedly an only child who supposedly died in Vietnam when they were very young, either wasn't Jewish or wasn't their father, or both. And they realized pretty quickly they almost surely have two different fathers. So a clear quest has been set out for the brothers, but not so clear for the writer, as I had to figure out what it was they might be able to figure out on this quest, and through their own inquiries, and build a story backed by a credible trail of their research, which I had to research, without necessarily knowing exactly where any of this was going, even though I mostly knew where it would end up, at least for one of them. But the end point of the paternal search for the other brother came as a surprise even to me. The next step for the characters was to do what any worthy journalist might do when tracking down a story. They spoke to people, their mother's sister, an old neighbor who lived next door to them when they were growing up, and they got nowhere. Either these folks didn't know anything or they weren't talking. So the brothers turned to the internet. Yes, finally the internet, a force for good. By the way, if the internet killed journalism, it supercharged fiction writing, as I cannot even comprehend how anyone ever wrote a novel without being able to find essential information and details via the instantaneous omniscience of the internet. Like, did the 100 Years' War really last 100 years? Or when were Oreos invented? So the brothers go online and eventually find lists of men born around their father's supposed birth year with his same name. And then they narrow that list down. They perform some old school research at an actual library. In this case, what would have been the Hewlett-Woodmere Public Library on Long Island in real life. But this brings up another interesting challenge for the fiction writer. I wrote the scene that takes place at this library, and coincidentally, just like me, the brothers remembered that there had been a Friendly's restaurant across the street from the library when they were growing up. But as a former journalist who wants to get even the fiction correct, I Google mapped the library and discovered there was actually a church across the street from it, which looked to have been there for a very long time. I mean, it had a graveyard full of leaning tombstones, which suggested age, which meant that the Friendly's restaurant I had remembered had actually been located somewhere else, or else I'd inadvertently created a restaurant, which presented me with two options. I could make certain that every detail about the library was correct, meaning either deleting or rewriting the scene referencing the Friendly's restaurant, so some reader who lived nearby wouldn't send a nasty email telling me I didn't know what I was talking about. Or I could just change the name of the library so that I could ascertain this was fiction. In which case I could put an alien robot work colony across the street from the library if I felt like it, and nobody could complain. In this same vein, there's a scene later in the novel that takes place at the Green Acres Mall parking lot, a real place in the town where I grew up, where Jenny, the boy's mother, teaches them to drive. I originally described one of the brothers nearly accelerating through the giant plate glass window of the Dime Savings Bank, a real bank, the one where I deposited the money from my newspaper route when I was 11 years old, my first real job in journalism. But then I wondered, was there a giant plate glass window at the Dime Savings Bank? So I went to the Googles again. Google Maps showed me the building, still there 50 years later, no window. Now, nobody takes out a window that big. So I recognized my memory was simply wrong again. This time I just changed the description of the bank, performing the hard work of removing the window myself, since I'd essentially installed it in the first place, because I wanted to talk about the Steak Pub and the House of Chang and the Pagoda Head Shop and other places that were really at the Green Acres Mall when I was a boy, and make this believable and fun for readers who knew the places I was referencing. But that's an aside. And by the way, asides are often intrinsic in fiction writing, as you can follow them sometimes for days to things that have no relation to what you are actually trying to learn about. And then somehow these things make it into the book just because you think they're cool. Some years ago, I attended a Portland Arts and Lectures talk about the creative process by the writer Anthony Doerr, who wrote All the Light We Cannot See. He showed all sorts of clever slides about research and creativity and how the mind works, and presented colorful charts and graphs. And then a slide popped up depicting a coatimundi, a ring-tailed cat. And Doerr related how he came across a reference to this animal by accident while researching his book, and went down a 3-day rabbit hole reading about the coatimundi before he remembered his purpose and went back to his real research. And I don't think the coatimundi ever appeared in the book, which is also an aside, so you can see what I mean. but it's also part of the fun of fiction. But back to the story of Philip and Spencer Elliott. At the now renamed library, they find Jack Elliott's obituary in the Nassau Chronicle, an old local newspaper that might sound a lot like the Nassau Herald, which was the actual local paper when I was growing up on Long Island. But
And turn right.
Since I didn't want to misrepresent that publication, and because I had some very specific info I needed the boys to find in the newspaper that might not have ever been included in the Nassau Herald, I changed the name of the paper. In the Nassau Chronicle, the brothers find the obituary of Jack Elliott, the man they'd always been led to believe was their father. The obituary mentions a number of siblings they didn't know that Jack Elliott had, since their mother had told them their father was an only child. They visit his gravesite in nearby Rockville Center and then track down one of those siblings, Jack's sister, who would be their aunt, except if he's not really their father, then she's not really their aunt, although in this case, that turns out not to be entirely true. Anyway, she convinces them that Jack Elliott couldn't possibly have been their father because he would have been overseas in Vietnam when they were conceived. So that answers one important question for the brothers, but raises many others, such as, now what? Which is when the real search and the real research begins. For the brothers, that is, always a troublemaker, isn't there? We'll talk about this. So, which is when the real search and the real research begins. For the brothers, that is, which means the writer's work only gets more complicated. Like many researchers, academics, journalists, amateur genealogists, the brothers start looking for original source documents for more information. But that's another story. Now let me spend a moment talking about the research I did into the subject of DNA to make the plot of Mr. Wizard credible and not make the writer sound like what Spencer Elliott would refer to as an idiot. In writing Mr. Wizard, I had to learn at least enough about DNA, what it is, how it works, how people can use it to find things out, to be able to employ its help in developing my story. And happily, since I was researching a story about two brothers on a search based on their own research, I was able to integrate some of my research into their story. Because as the characters I developed them to be, they would have been reading some of the same materials I was reading. And I read quite a few books about DNA and ancestry. After learning a little about DNA tests, I continued my research by going back to read about Gregor Mendel, the so-called father of genetics, which is an ironic title, and his pea plants, because I remembered learning about that in earth science back in junior high school on one of the days I wasn't kicked out of class. And so early on, when the brothers are just revving up their research, they have a conversation about Mendel and the pea plants and what they remember learning in science class on the days that Spencer wasn't kicked out of class. Several other sections of the novel make use of my background research by having one of the brothers reference it. And they talk about the things they were learning, which happen to be the same things I was learning. They talk about Crick and Watson and Rosalind Franklin, a woman who was involved in the search to identify the structure of DNA, but essentially disappears from the story. The brothers talk about things like the APOE gene, which guides the fight or flight response. They talk about E.O. Wilson and what traits might have come to them via DNA, and which might have been engendered by the way their mother raised them, and which might be purely circumstantial, and how all of this determined who they were now in their mid-50s, having learned who their real fathers were. And in some cases, this is exactly what DNA tests help searchers to do, put families together, or even back together, which is also what some novels try to do. And this kind of research, not just on DNA, but on the facts, is what creates the truth in fiction. Let me close by telling you a little bit now about how and why I created a fictitious Irish golf town and golf course in the novels without ever having to pay taxes on either. I've probably made close to a dozen trips to Ireland over the years, and so have some familiarity with Irish towns, big and small. The scenes set in Mr. Wizard and the sequel, Everyone Here, that occur in Dublin were researched so that characters walk down the correct street to see a particular statue, for example, or end up not at the Temple Bar, but a small pub that isn't named because the characters are good enough travelers to try to avoid places mentioned in guidebooks. They drive actual specific highways from Dublin to reach the fictitious town of Ballydroit. But once they arrive, truth is abandoned by the side of the road. Although the town and the golf course and the pub are all based on real places I've visited, or at least on my sometimes imperfect memory of those places, in the book they are fictionalized so I could manipulate the details to suit my own purposes, which would be a convenient superpower in life. And by the way, the name of the town and golf course is Gaelic for Home of the Wizard, which is one of many puzzles built into the fiction that most people will never even recognize. In Everyone Here, the sequel to Mr. Wizard, every chapter title is actually a puzzle to be solved. One more thing about Ballydroit and truth in fiction. When I was a teenager, I spent a summer working as a camp counselor in New York's Catskill Mountains. On our rare nights off, we venture into the small town of Monticello, where there was a long abandoned restaurant with an old neon sign that was missing several of the letters, which had apparently just fallen off the building. One day, one of the other counselors referenced the place as St. Euronce. You can visualize this when you think of the word restaurant missing several letters. It was a brilliant observation from someone I previously considered dim, so that was fun. And I knew at that very moment, at the age of 18, that I would use this someday in some short story or something else that I felt at that time destined to write. And so I carried the entirety of St. Euronce with me everywhere I traveled and lived for the next 40 years until I finally unpacked it to describe the local pub in the town of Ballydroit, Ireland, in Mr. Wizard. I hope anyone who reads the novels and finds something I got wrong about Ireland or Portland, which is in the second book, or any of the other locales or references will let me know, as I have worked hard to remain true to most facts in these books, or at least at the very least to the true spirit of something if the specific facts didn't matter. There is one actual error of fact in the first book that was pointed out by a friend. And let me tell you, you can always count on your friends for those things. Not long after publication, but I will not tell you what it is. I decided that in much the same way that artists in certain cultures purposely include a flaw in their works so as not to compete with God's perfect creation, I would leave it in. Besides which, it was too late to correct it. I couldn't have done this in journalism, the mistake or the rationalization, but such is the freedom of the novelist. I also fear there may be a flaw in this talk, which is going on for too long, so I will end it here.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'm sure there are going to be some questions and comments for you after the meeting.